Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Parrot Analytics Live. My name is Samuel, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Parrot Analytics. To get started, I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our Demand 360 enterprise customers. Thank you, as always, for making the time to be with us here today, especially those that are connecting from various time zones around the globe. We do appreciate it. As we wait for the room to fill, please feel free to write in the chat where you're joining from. It's always super interesting to see all of the various countries represented. And just remember, by default, chat is set to hosts and panelists. So just switch that around over to everyone before you send your message. In our session today, you will be treated to a walkthrough of our latest global demand report, presented by the author, our very own Industry Insights Manager, Christofer Hamilton. Especially for those of you that are new to a Parrot Analytics Live, you will love what Chris has to share with you today. Hello, everyone. Los Angeles, Toronto, Brazil, currently in Spain. Hope you're enjoying that there. Dublin, Ireland. So cool to see various countries and nationalities represented, especially those of you that are making time on holidays to connect. I presume you're working. India, Argentina, fantastic. Poland. Thank you, thank you. All right, just a couple of admin things before we get started. We have received all the questions that you have already submitted. Thank you. And we'll address some of those at the end of the webinar. You can, of course, submit other questions that you have throughout the webinar in the chat. Please select everyone when you submit your question, as sometimes we do get the same question asked twice. And on that, yes, you will get an email with the presentation. So we'll definitely send that out. And once we're done with our official session today, we'll answer as many of those additional questions that we can. Miami in the house. All right. And now I'd like to hand over to you, Chris. I'm looking forward to what you have to share with us all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Samuel. I'm also looking forward to sharing some of my favorite insights from our mid-year report. So it's always a bit of a treat for me to get to share with people some of our findings. What are we going to be looking at today? So to kick things off, we've got a high-level look at some global streaming trends. Then I pulled out a few specific insights from the US streaming market. And then to wrap things up, I've got a few of the most interesting insights from 10 different markets we've looked at around the world. This is always a lot of fun, pulling out really granular insights from these different countries. So starting with a look at the state of global streaming. But before we even look at demand for content, I wanted to take a look at the supply side of the equation. So what are we looking at here? This is the number of streaming original series that have premiered every quarter, basically since 2020. And we see there's been a fantastic boom in the amount of new streaming content. From 2020 to Q2 of 2022, the number of streaming original series more than doubled. And where we're at as of Q2 2024, we're almost at 4 times the amount of streaming original series that we had at the beginning of 2020. So this is a pretty straightforward growth story. But I actually think this next chart better traces the ups and downs of the entertainment industry over the last few years. So adding in this blue line is looking at the rate of new series premieres quarter on quarter over time. So we can see back at the beginning of 2020, the first 2 quarters there, we had some really rapid growth in new streaming original premieres, peaking at a little over 10% quarter on quarter growth. That drops off when the pandemic really takes hold. And we had depressed growth for a few quarters and then sort of entered this era of recovery, peaking at the end of 2022. So right around the end of 2022, we were about back to the 10% quarter on quarter growth we were seeing at the start of 2020. But then 2023 was a story of slowing down, and that was definitely exacerbated by the strikes. You can see the slowdown started at the beginning of the year, but then really dropped off towards the end of the year. So far, 2024 has been a bit of a mixed bag. In Q1, we saw a bit of an uptick in the rate of new streaming originals premiering, but then in Q2, it fell again to a new low, 3.9% quarter-on-quarter growth in new series. So I think the jury's still out on whether 2024 is going to be a pivot point to a new era of booming content, or if this is just the new normal as streamers look to find sustainable profitability. And I did want to call out that Netflix was a bit of an exception here. So here we're looking at Netflix's share of streaming original premieres every quarter. We can see for years from 2020 really through 2023, Netflix had a smaller and smaller share of new series premiering, basically as it lost its first mover advantage, new streaming platforms debuting, releasing new content. Netflix made up a smaller and smaller share of the pie in terms of new series being released. But basically since the end of 2023, there's been a bit of an uptick as other platforms have pulled back, but Netflix has still kept up strong pipeline of new content. So we're seeing an uptick from Netflix. This is just one of several metrics that really highlight the strength of this platform. So I really love this next chart because it shows how platforms are balancing old and new content. So here we're looking now focused on the US, specifically their catalog demand in the first half of 2024. And we've broken it up by when a show last released an episode. So in pink, this is demand for shows that released an episode this year. So very fresh new content. In blue, that's shows that released an episode in 2023. I should say last released an episode in 2023. So these shows might not be concluded yet, but they might not have yet released new content this year. So a little older. And then in purple, we've got demand for shows that last released an episode before 2023. So these shows are definitely older. It's been quite a while since they've released any new content. A majority of these are probably ended. So what are some takeaways from this? I think one of the most surprising insights is how effectively Netflix is leveraging older content to engage its subscribers. So we see here almost 60% of demand for shows on Netflix in the first half of the year was for shows that last released an episode in 2022 or earlier. That's pretty impressive, given that it's been so long since there's been new content released for these shows. We also see a similar thing with Disney Plus, but I think it's a bit of a different story. So we know that Disney is a master of its franchises. I think what's going on here is that as new shows and movies are released in a franchise with connections to older content, we tend to see that increases demand for older shows just because of those connections. So I think that's part of the story with why Disney has a higher share of demand for older content. On the flip side of things, we have Peacock. So Peacock had the largest share of demand for shows that released an episode so far this year. 36% of demand for shows on platform was for one of these series. And we know that Peacock is really reliant on fresh content, especially coming from NBC. I think Saturday Night Live is a really good example. So we know that show is really dependent on topical commentary, fresh new episodes. But I do want to highlight just how much this new content is overperforming on Peacock. So shows that released an episode in 2024 only make up around 13% of the platform's catalog, but they're driving 36% of the platform's demand. So that's a significant overperformance for new content on Peacock. And I really think last year's example of Suits just highlights these two platforms' approaches really well. So bit of background, Suits ended in 2019, and it was never hugely in demand since that point. Really didn't pop up in our rankings. Was available on Peacock, but then last year when it became available on Netflix, it became something of a cultural phenomenon. It boomed in demand, so I think that really just shows how Netflix is using its massive reach to turn some of these older shows into new hits without even releasing new episodes. And I mentioned a bit about franchises. So one thing we've been tracking is potential franchise fatigue for Disney Plus. So here we're looking at the share of demand for shows on Disney Plus that are in the Marvel or Star Wars universe. So we've seen falling demand, I should say a falling demand share, so less relative importance compared to the rest of the catalog from these two franchises. But in particular, Marvel's share of demand for shows on Disney Plus has fallen from around 19% in 2022 to around 12% today. So that's a pretty significant decline. I will highlight that Star Wars has held up better. You can see that in this chart. So something we're watching, but I think, yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on. And some of the big news items from this year so far have been really surprising, actually. So we've seen these rival entertainment companies partnering together to create a super bundle, you might call it. So here we're highlighting this example between the Hulu Max Disney Plus bundle. It was really surprising to see Disney partnering with Warner Brothers Discovery on a cross-platform bundle. But this wasn't the only example we saw this year. We also had Netflix partnering with Peacock and Apple TV Plus. So I think this might be an indicator that we're seeing a new era of consolidation in the streaming industry. And what is this chart looking at? This chart is basically just looking at the catalogs of these platforms and where they overlap and how much they overlap. And I think it's important to highlight that the most effective bundles are going to minimize catalog overlap. So you're creating that incremental value for subscribers. And we see a pretty thin sliver of overlap between these three platforms. So it really is creating additional value for people signing up to this new super bundle. Now this next chart, kind of building on what we just looked at, but I always love to highlight this because it's really capturing how consumers are experiencing their streaming choices, I think. So on the y-axis, we have the total demand for shows and movies on each of these platforms or bundles. And on the x-axis, we have the monthly subscription cost. So it's kind of the two sides of the coin that consumers are experiencing. On the one hand, what makes them want a platform is having in-demand shows and movies, a larger catalog, so that's captured on the y-axis. But the trade-off is obviously how much they have to pay each month for these offerings. And when we plot these platforms this way, I think we can get a sense of which platforms are most attractively priced for consumers and which ones might have a bit room to increase prices. But today I wanted to focus specifically on a bit of the strategy with how platforms are priced individually versus as a bundle. So if you look at Disney Plus Premium, and Hulu, we see that those are both a little expensive compared to the competition in terms of what they offer for demand on their platform. So priced a little expensively, but then when we look at the Disney Plus Hulu bundle in green up there, that's one of the most attractively priced options for consumers. So the pricing is definitely structured to incentivize people to sign up for the bundle because they're getting a great deal with it. But if we look at the brand new Disney Plus Hulu Max Super Bundle, we see it's not priced as aggressively as the Disney Plus Hulu standalone bundle. It's actually a bit more expensive than we'd expect. I think this might be an indicator that this move is more of a retention move than an acquisition move. I think if it were designed to incentivize as many people to sign up as possible, it would be priced really aggressively like the Disney Plus Hulu bundle. Instead, it really isn't, but we know that subscribers sign up to a bundled offering are less likely to churn than those signed up for individual platforms. So I think these three platforms are partnering together to maybe reduce churn some. And finally, I want to highlight Netflix. Netflix is still the best value in terms of demand per dollar for what it offers consumers. So priced really attractively for consumers. And I think that's part of the story with this platform's industry-leading churn rate. So it has consistently had the lowest churn rate across most of these platforms. And that's part of the equation. It's offering consumers hugely in-demand catalog priced at an attractive point compared to the competition. So they really have an incentive to stick around. Cool. So I want to spend some time focusing on interesting insights about movies because normally we spend more time on shows, but we do track demand for movies, and it's really an important component to consider to get the full picture when we're analyzing these platforms in the streaming industry, sort of like we just did. So a few movie insights. One thing we looked at this summer was off-season demand for the horror genre. I should say for horror movies. So what are we looking at here? This is over the last 4 years, looking at which months horror movies premiered in, and then the average demand in the first 30 days for movies that premiered in each month. So the purple bars, that's the share of movie premieres over the last horror movie premieres over the last 4 years. We can see there's a huge spike in the number of movies premiering in October. No surprise there. That's when Halloween is. There's a huge seasonal surge around that time. But it is interesting to note that horror movies premiering in October tend to have lower demand on average. So we see horror movies that premiered in October only had around 5 times the average movie demand in their first 30 days. And that's lower than horror movies that premiered anytime through April or September on average over the last 4 years. So there's really a benefit to off-season scheduling around the summer for horror movies. And we had a few examples of horror movies premiering during the summer. I think the most recent one, just squeaking in September, was Beetlejuice, and that had a fantastic premiere. So September seems to be the best of both worlds in terms of scheduling. You maybe get a bit of that Halloween, October demand, but it's just at the tail end of summer. Movies premiering in September had 7.4 times the average movie demand in the first 30 days. So that seems to be the sweet spot, but summer in general is good. I also wanted to highlight the end of the year holidays. So if we look at December, this month has the fewest horror movies premiering over the last 4 years. It also has the lowest average demand for horror movies that premiere in December. I like to think of this as the feel-good holiday season, and it seems that audiences really don't have the appetite for horror content after Halloween. So if you're planning on releasing a horror movie around the end of your holidays, be careful because it seems like there isn't necessarily the appetite for this content then. Great. So this next section, I'm excited about sharing because it's some new data we haven't released before. And it's really a different way to cut our data and extract some new insights. So in addition to tracking demand for content, we also measure the demographics of the audiences for this content. In the next few charts, I'm going to flip the usual way we look at things. So rather than looking at what the demographics are for a particular genre, I want to understand the genre preferences for each age group that we track. So to do this, we took the movies with audiences that were most skewed towards each generation, and then looked at the genre breakdown of each group. And we actually had a really good question coming ahead of time. I want to highlight someone from the NBA asked about what genres you would target to break through with specific demographics. And that's exactly what this analysis is. It's understanding the unique content preferences of different age groups so you can better appeal to them. Cool. Let's walk through this first chart just to explain what's going on. So for each age group, we took all the movies where that age group made up more than twice its average share of audience. So basically, only looking at movies that heavily skewed towards each age demographic. And then we looked at the genre makeup of each group of movies. So how to read this? We've got the 4 generations we track. So Gen Z in red, Zennials in blue, Millennials in pink, and finally Gen X or older in purple. What do these numbers mean? How to read this? So Gen Z was the most comedy-loving age group. So a little over 50% of movies with heavily Gen Z skewing audiences were comedies. And that's the highest across all generations. And we see it tends to drop off as we look at older generations. And finally, when we look at Gen X and older, only 25.6% of movies with audiences skewed towards this age group were comedies. So there's definitely a bit of a trend over time with comedies becoming less popular for older audiences. But now I want to focus on genre preferences that make each generation unique. So we're going to start with Gen Z. Gen Z is definitely an animation-loving generation. So we can see that over 40% of movies with heavily Gen Z skewing audiences are animated. And that's significantly above the share of animated movies that skew towards any other generation. So if you're looking to target Gen Z, animation is definitely a good option. One question that I did have that's still unanswered is whether or not this generation will stay animation lovers as they age, or is this a genre preference that audiences age out of? So still TBD on that, but something to watch. So Zennials are interesting. They're a bit of a micro generation between Gen Z and Millennials. So digging into the data, you can see sometimes their genre preferences tend more towards Gen Z. Other times it's more similar to millennials. But the one genre that set this generation apart was really romance. So 30% of movies with a heavily Xennial skewing audience were romance, and that's well above the share for the genre for other generations. So yeah, I've labeled them romantics at heart. It was interesting to finally find something that set them apart, given they're kind of sandwiched between these other two generations. Millennials had a really clear genre preference, and that's horror. So almost 20% of movies with heavily millennial skewed audiences were horror movies. And that's more than twice the share for any other generation. So clear genre preference for horror among millennials. Not entirely sure what's driving that. You can hypothesize what you will. Maybe it says something about the horrors of the millennial experience. I don't know. And finally, with the oldest age group that we track, Gen X and older, Westerns definitely set them apart. So while this is genre makes up a small share of movies in general, 3.2% of movies with Gen X or older skewing audiences were Westerns, and that's more than 3 times the share it was for any other generation. So distinct genre preference there, even though it is a small share of movies overall. But to put it in perspective a bit, I wanted to highlight animation versus Westerns. So the share of movies skewed towards Gen X plus that were animation was only 1.5%. So it's half the share that Westerns are. And I really think that animation and Westerns encapsulate the genre preference differences between the oldest and youngest age groups nicely. Perfect. So that was some data on movies, but now we're going to get into market-specific insights. And this is always a lot of fun to pick out what makes each market uniquely tick. So sometimes in our quarterly reports, we focus on a sub-region, which is always nice because you can kind of understand how that region is unique compared to global demand, but then also dig into each individual country to understand what makes it tick. So for example, last quarter, we looked at some of the most important markets in the Mideast North Africa region. This quarter, we had the 4 countries in the Nordics region. So what sets the Nordic region apart? Across the board, these 4 countries had the highest share of demand for the adventure genre. And the adventure genre can encapsulate scripted content like House of the Dragon and Fallout, but it can also include reality shows like Survivor, and in particular in this region, Gold Rush and Expedition Robinson were really popular. So I think love of adventure content spans scripted and unscripted shows in this region. And conversely, the region had the lowest share of demand for music content. Think of this like music reality shows, music competition series. So that type of show really didn't win over audiences in the Nordics region. Now we're going to look at each country individually to understand a bit more about what made them unique. So starting with Norway, when we think about content being exported globally from the Nordics region, we tend to think of that Nordic noir. And that really seems to be popular also in Norway. So the crime, procedural, and thriller genres, they all had a higher share of demand in Norway than any of the other markets we looked at, including the other countries in the Nordics region. So clear genre preference there. Sweden was a bit tricky. So I feel like in every report we do, there's some country that whose genre preferences tend more towards the median and don't stand out particularly clearly. That was Sweden in this report. So we had to dig one level further. But once you start looking at the subgenres, Sweden does have some clear preferences. So paranormal, spy, and science content, these all made up a larger share of demand in Sweden than in other markets. And it is nice to get that granular subgenre preference view for all countries. So we have that in the report. Finland had a really clear preference. So this was our most anime-loving market, and that's not just across the Nordic countries, that's across all markets we looked at, including some Asian countries, which tend to have higher demand for anime in general. So it was surprising to see high demand for anime in Finland. And you can also see this when we look at the share of demand for shows by original platform. So A few Japanese channels, Tokyo MX, TV Tokyo, and ATX, they all popped up in the top 15 channels by original series in Finland, and that's really being driven by their original anime series that are being exported to Finland. And finally, closing out with Denmark. So Denmark was interesting, had a bit of a contrast. So on average, Denmark had pretty middling demand for the comedy genre as a whole. But when you dig one level further, we saw that it was the most sitcom-loving market we looked at. So it's interesting to see that it had about average demand for comedies in general, but really sitcoms were a format that worked here. And actually, I have a fun anecdote about Denmark in terms of a specific show that succeeded there. So, and I just love this example because it gives you a sense of the cool things you see when you dig down to that show level in each of these markets. So I'm sure everyone's either seen or is familiar with The Bear, the show from FX, about the restaurant industry, set in Chicago, very place specific to that city. But if you know a bit more about it, you'll know that several scenes and episodes were shot in Copenhagen, actually. And it seems that that was enough to make this show stand out in Denmark. So it actually ranked more high in demand in Denmark than any other market we looked at, including the US. I just think that's a really fun anecdote about how including place-specific scenes and content can really help break through with audiences in different markets. So I was really excited this quarter to be covering Korea. We always see Korean content popping up in other markets because it's been such an export success story. But it's really exciting to look domestically and see what's going on within Korea. So I think unsurprisingly, Korea was the most drama-loving market we looked at. We know that it's become known worldwide for the international success of its K-dramas specifically. But it's interesting to see that dramas are still so popular domestically. So almost 60% of demand for shows in Korea was for a drama. And I want to put some numbers on the global success of K-dramas. So here we're looking at global demand for Korean series, broken down by whether a show is a drama or not. And we see that the vast majority of demand for Korean content globally is for those dramas. So it's really K-dramas that have been the success story. And we have a few of those examples breaking through in other markets we looked at. So Ecuador was one of the countries we covered. Queen of Tears, which is a recent K-drama, ranked higher in demand in Ecuador than any market outside of Asia. And in Latin America, we've seen a lot of international success from Turkish dramas. So a lot of those shows were popping up in the rankings in Ecuador in this report, but then in other markets in the past. So it was interesting to see a K-drama catching on in this region. So Queen of Tears ranked as the 39th most in-demand show for the quarter in Ecuador. This other K-drama, High School Return of a Gangster, that really stood out in another market we covered, Indonesia. So only Indonesia and Korea, they were the only two markets where this show broke into the top 100 shows in demand. So definitely something uniquely appealing to Indonesian audiences here with this show. I did want to emphasize though, so when we look at the global demand for Korean series there, it's heavily skewed towards dramas, but then domestically, when we're looking at Korean demand for local series, it's more balanced between dramas and non-dramas. So dramas aren't so overwhelmingly popular in Korea. A lot of local non-drama series make up a fair share of demand. And the Philippines, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at adaptations of Korean series. So these aren't Korean series specifically, but they're an adaptation of a Korean show. And the Philippines actually had several examples of adaptations of Korean series that did really well. So this example, What's Wrong with Secretary Kim, that's based on a Korean show that has the same name, but this is What's Wrong with Secretary Kim, the Philippines version. And that did really well, ranked as the 47th most in-demand show for the quarter. And I think this is a different way you can think about having export success. So rather than directly exporting shows like we saw with Queen of Tears, for example, this is an example of how existing show can be adapted for a market. And I do want to highlight that What's Wrong with Secretary Kim is maybe more of a romantic comedy than a strict drama. So I think that might be part of the reason why a local adaptation succeeded rather than the original show. We know that dramas travel so well, especially compared to comedies or other genres of content. We have another example here in the Philippines. So Running Man is a Korean variety show that's hugely popular in its home market, but it hasn't had quite as much success abroad as K-dramas. But we did see a local adaptation in the Philippines breaking through. So ranked in the top 100 shows by demand, Running Man Philippines. And I think this is just another model of how Korean content can, it's a different way that Korean content can find export success through adaptations rather than directly exporting shows. And finally, we also looked at New Zealand. So if you showed up to the last webinar, you'll remember that we were looking at Australia. We highlighted Bluey's success around the world. One thing that jumped out from New Zealand was that this country really loved content from its neighbor, Australia. So we see Bluey ranking as the 5th most in-demand show for the quarter, but then a few other Australian series, Married at First Sight and MasterChef Australia. But I think the bigger trend that was noticeable in New Zealand was a love of British content. So several British shows popped up in demand in New Zealand. Here I've just highlighted 3. These are all actually Netflix series. So Bridgerton was the most in-demand show for the quarter, but we also saw Baby Reindeer and The Gentleman, all Netflix originals, all British shows, ranking high in demand in New Zealand. But it's not just Netflix that's having success bringing British content to New Zealand. We saw a high share of demand for several channels. BBC, so BBC, ITV, and Channel 4. What does this mean? This means BBC originals made up 6.7% of demand for shows across all shows in New Zealand. This was the highest share of demand for the BBC in this report. So clear success with New Zealand audiences. We also saw ITV and Channel 4 break into the top 15 platforms. They didn't break into the top platforms for most markets we looked at, so definitely succeeding in New Zealand compared to other countries. And here are a few of those shows that are winning over Kiwi audiences. So obviously Doctor Who, coming in at number 15, very popular show globally. We also have Taskmaster, Britain's Got Talent. So just to give you a taste of all of the British content that's winning over Kiwi audiences. So that's everything I've prepared for today. But just a reminder, if you want the full report to get a deep dive into all 10 of the markets we looked at, really see some of those granular insights at the subgenre and show level, you can get it on our Demand 360 platform. And we've got a 30% discount for everyone who's attended the webinar today for Demand 360 Lite, where you can get our latest report. You can also get all of our previous reports, all of our insights articles, and get demand on over 30,000 TV shows, more than 18,000 movies, over 40,000 talent in more than 50 markets and globally. So there's really a lot in there to investigate. Check it out. I'd highly recommend it. Just give me a minute to see what questions have come through the chat. But we also had a few questions come in ahead of time. So I've prepared a few answers to those. Always appreciate people submitting questions ahead of time. Gives us a bit of advance notice to take a look at things. Just give me a second.
It's a big pause, but actually I've answered all the questions, Chris.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah.
Great.
I could have left the dramatic pause a bit longer, but you know.
Well,
So
then I'll start by looking at some of the questions that came in ahead of time, if that's okay. So we actually had a couple questions come in about the documentary genre. In terms of just trends and what to look for. So I pulled some data going back to 2019 on the share of demand for documentary series. And this is something we've been tracking over the course of the pandemic. It was a big story. Some of the biggest shows from that era, think Tiger King, The Last Dance, really making headlines. And we see that from 2019 to 2021, there was a growing share of demand for documentary series globally and in the US. So in general, the US has higher demand for documentaries. This is something that's been pretty consistent. Global audiences aren't quite as into documentaries as Americans are, but they had a similar trajectory from 2019 to 2021. Things cooled off a bit across the board in 2022. But since then, the US and global audiences have taken divergent paths. So documentaries have become more popular in the US. The share of demand for these shows has grown, but it's continued to taper off globally. So I think we're seeing a bit of a split there. And actually, I always use the US as an example of the most documentary-loving market, but there's another country that loves documentaries even more. Can anyone guess what that is? It's the UK. So British audiences are actually huge documentary fans, consistently beat out the US. And we see a trend there that really matches the US. So surging growth in demand for documentaries until 2021, a bit of a cool-off period, but resuming growth since then. So those are some high-level trends for documentaries. We also had a couple of questions come through specifically about Vietnam and Thailand, which I think might be a good sign for us that we should do the Southeast Asia region, Samuel, in the future. Seems like there were questions coming through about those countries. So I actually just hopped into our platform, Demand 360, and pulled the top 10 shows over the last 30 days for these countries. So these are the top 10 most in-demand series from Thailand and Vietnam. And I just highlighted a few things. So it seems that anime is more popular in Vietnam, just at this high level. The top two shows are in Vietnam are both Japanese anime. Jujutsu Kaisen, we see that popping up around the world, but it's ranking #1 in Vietnam, doesn't even break the top 10 in Thailand. So it's an interesting difference. And then in Thailand, we see local originals and local adaptations of international franchises are doing really well. So the most in-demand show for the last 30 days in Thailand is The Voice Thailand. Obviously, that's an adaptation of the international hit franchise The Voice. We see a few Thai originals, Gap, for example, Terror Tuesday at #9. So that's a recent Netflix original. And then obviously MasterChef Thailand. So the MasterChef franchise has been hugely popular around the world. We saw MasterChef Australia earlier. But it is making into the top 10 most in-demand shows in Thailand. So it really seems local content succeeding there. That's just a couple of quick high-level insights. And yeah, I think we're at time. So did any other questions come in?
No, but sometimes
Okay.
we do get a surge, but
That's fine. I think we will wrap it up then. So really appreciate everyone showing up today. It's always a treat for me to get to share some of these insights. I hope that everyone learned something, and hopefully we'll see everyone back at our next Parrot Analytics Live. Uh,
yeah,
Thanks for showing
absolutely.
up.
Thank you, Chris. Look, it's
Yeah,
always so insightful to learn stuff as I sit in on these sessions. And one quick takeaway from me was great to get that exclusive look at our audience demographic data set. Incredible to see that 40% of Gen Z love animated movies.
yeah.
A very clear genre preference and an excellent data point to support strategic content investments. Um, if you have any further questions, you can reach out to us. Please, yeah, get in contact. The easiest way to do that is to just look out for that email that we'll send out in the next couple of days with the webinar recording and this presentation, and you can just hit reply, come back to us with any questions that you may have. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, please do follow us so we get notified, so that you get notified when we go live next. Just checking for any last questions. No, we're good. Thank you again, everybody, for being with us here today. And we're looking
Thanks,
forward to
everyone.
seeing you at the next Parrot Analytics Live. Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.